Anything is possible. You can remove all obstacles.
Let it be a reminder that you can do anything, and together we can make a difference. Peace is a process, not an event. Follow the path. You can pray the devil back to hell. Water, peace, fear, to love the sick. To have some peace talks and show a little honor. To have some peace to make sure your dreams come true.
Hello and welcome to May Peace Be With You. My name is Justin. I feel as though the first few episodes of my podcast I blurted into existence. I gave the listener no context, no real explanation of the journey that I'm on or the journey that I've been on for some time. So I'd like to take this opportunity to start over. Allow me to introduce myself and tell you about this journey that I've been on for some time. Let's start from the beginning. In 2014, I was asked a very simple question. Papi, what does peace mean? As my innocent child stuck up two little fingers. Alina's daycare allowed parents to volunteer, and I had the day off, so I spent the entire day there. Her teacher, Miss Francine, was kind enough to allow me to read during story time. We napped together. It was the perfect day. Very peaceful day. At the end of the day, her mother came to pick her up. It was winter, so I put on her coat. I picked her up, and her classroom was the last classroom down a 100-foot hallway. And she asked me the very simple question, what does peace mean? And she showed me her two little fingers. And I honestly didn't know what to say. I said something to the effect of, it's like peace. And I just thought it was such an interesting predicament that I was put in. I had a very short walk to her mother's car, and I had to explain a very complex idea. And I thought that predicament was fascinating. So I turned to my friends and I turned to my family and I put them in the predicament. I say, you pick up Alina, she's 4 years old, you have a 100-foot hallway. What does peace mean? I'll give you 3 of my best answers. Number 1, I'll never forget. My mother. I give her the entire happening, and before I could finish my question, she said 3 things. Number 1, nice. I forget number 2 and number 3, but number 1 was just so perfect that I was dumbstruck. That is the way to do it. Simply to be nice outwardly. And inward peace will come. My friend and coworker, D, a man of few words, he simply said, peace and love. No follow-up, no explanation further, but I definitely think about that from time to time. The parallels between peace and love. When I say goodbye, I say peace and love. Most people say something to the effect of peace means happy. The third answer that really revolutionized my thinking on the idea was someone who confided in me that her mother was ill for some time. And in the end, she was not happy. But there was a peace. Her mother was no longer in pain and she could rest easy. I think maybe that was the catalyst that said I really need to dive further. And I've always been interested in world religions. I remember I had a class called World Religions that really opened up my mind and my eyes to the universality of religion. I believe that most people's grief is not with religion, but with the church. That was Jesus's grief. That was the Buddha's grief with the Hindu church. It wasn't the religion, it was the church. But I study all religions. I think that if I can pull wisdom from these ancient religions, then this furthers me in my journey, because I know that people draw peace from their religion, of all religions. The reason why they are religious is because it brings them peace. I want to discover what about these religions brings peace to people. I was raised Catholic, but since the introduction to Buddha in my life, I would consider myself a Buddhist. I believe Jesus died for my sins, and I'm very grateful, and I give thanks on Easter, and I give thanks on Christmas, and I say thank you, Jesus, for giving your life for me. But I need a practical how-to guide as to how to live my life based on the life of Jesus. How do I live my life the way Jesus lived his life? A life of kindness and love. And I think I'm getting off topic. This question plagued my mind, and I studied all religions, and I studied the different factions of each religions, and the origins of each of them. And not only religion, but I philosophers, from Tony Robbins to Socrates. And I made so many wonderful discoveries, and I had all this wonderful, useful information in my mind. And I said to myself, what are you going to do with all this information? What if you get hit by a bus tomorrow? And I began to think of my legacy. What will be left of me if I were to happen to have died today? And I decided to write a book. And I took my information, I took my research, and I made an outline. And I took this outline, and the outline evolved over time. And I used this outline to conduct interviews with my friends and family for about 2 years. Well, actually, my interview with my nana was in 2018. So I took this outline and I used it to interview all of my friends. And these interviews are not in a podcast format. These interviews were for the purposes of furthering my book. My intention was to challenge my ideas, was to say, this is what I believe. I want you to question what I believe and tell me this is what I believe. My outline evolved, and it evolved, and it evolved, and it evolved. And every 2 interviews, I did another outline, and I did that for about 30 interviews. One of these interviews was with my nana in 2018. This was something that I'm so grateful to have. This is episode 2 of my podcast, My Humble Shepherd. So I make these recordings and it sits in storage, and I take a break from the book. I tried to write it several times, but each time I did, I discovered I am not sure if I'm feeling this feeling that I wish to share with others. I think I came to a point where I decided that there was a way in which I can exist that would facilitate perpetual inner peace. And I decided to test that theory. And I decided to live this way. And I'm Johnny Appleseed, sowing good seeds. And I'm trying to avoid sowing bad seeds. And I'm beginning to live a more peaceful existence. I am a human person that lives in this world, and there are needs that I need to meet. Since 2014, I have been on a journey, but along this journey, I studied money. And I've worked many different jobs. And 4 years ago, I found a stable job that was able to support myself well enough. And just recently, I was able to support myself well enough that I can begin to strive to fulfill some more spiritual needs. So I have all these wonderful recordings sitting in storage, and I'm trying to live the principles of all the useful information that I found. And life happens. I have another child, and I have many responsibilities, and some things get pushed to the side. So the effort on the book slowed down, and one day on a whim, I am looking through my old paperwork, and I find my interview, and I have some free time. It's middle of the night. I record episode 1 of the podcast, which wasn't a podcast. It was me in the middle of the night with an old interview that I used to interview my friends. And I decided to interview myself and to see how far, and to see perhaps what has changed. This is episode 1 of the podcast, the self-interview and introduction. It's funny that some of my ideas in this interview shock myself, because as my ideas evolved and changed, I started to dive down different rabbit holes, and apparently some got left behind. And it was such a wonderful journey to go back to the beginning, and it's such a wonderful outline as well. with so many wonderful ideas that organically grew within me over this period, over this journey. And I'm so happy to be able to share them with you. The reason why I actually posted this in the first place is because a friend wanted to hear some of my ideas from my book. And he was telling me, well, I mean, you've been talking about this for some time. Like, what is this? You know, what's happening with it? Where are you with it? Are you doing anything with it? It's just one of those things that people just talk about. So I decided, well, I have this interview that I did with myself. It's a pre-recorded interview. So maybe I'll do something with that. This was early 2022. And in spring of 2022, my grandmother passes. My humble shepherd, my Nana. And so I'm grieving for many months. And I think to myself, well, you have these two pre-recorded interviews, one with yourself and one with your Nana, that you want to put out there to the world. So why don't you turn this book, May Peace Be With You, into the podcast, May Peace Be With You? And so I did. And I am so grateful to my friends and my family who have participated in this experiment. I edited and published my self-interview and introduction with very little context. I knew I had this interview and I thought that it was interesting. And so I just edited the ums and the ahs and I hit send. No context. Is as is. No introduction, no theme song or music, just pure interview. And I did with the next. And I did it with my Nana and I published. And I did it again with my cousin Gary and my cousin Nicole and my friend Raul, my first fan. Shout out to Raul Bahana. He said, why don't you have an introduction where you explain who this person is? And I said, yeah, of course. Why wouldn't I have a brief introduction? And so after about 5 episodes, 2 cousins, one friend, Chewy, and my dearly departed Nana, I decided, okay, who is Chris Rhodes? So I say, who is Chris Rhodes? And then I have my next episode of Chris Drain. And he said, why don't you have a theme song? And I said, I should have a theme song. I've been thinking about a theme song, and here we are. This is let's see. My first posting was 6/18. So we're about 5 months from the inception of this journey, this podcasting journey. Now I have a theme song. I'm very grateful to my friends and family who were able to participate in this wacky experiment of mine. And I hope to continue and persist with this. I think that the journey towards peace is ubiquitous. I think that some people seek power. Some people seek success or money or fame or love. But at the end of the day, we all seek this feeling that we feel when we're happy. We seek this feeling of inner peace. And as I look around in the world, there simply isn't enough of it. So let's make it my mission. Let's make this my mission to what is my goal? Who am I? As it sometimes happens along this journey, I vexed myself. I asked 2 questions that I didn't have a ready answer for. I said, who am I? And what are my goals? Let's start with the first. In my freshman year of college, I took an inane class that was entitled, Who Am I? The only thing that I remember from that class is day 1. On the front cover of my notebook, I wrote, Who am I? Justin Roberson. But that leads to a new question. Who is Justin Roberson? Where to begin? I was born and raised in Chicago proper. specifically at Norwegian Hospital in Humboldt Park. And I grew up not too far from there. My father's half of the family lived on Chicago Avenue near the 1994 Expressway, pretty much encircling Eckerd Park. It's where I grew up. It's where I learned how to swim. It's where I went to summer camp every year. When I was a teenager, I worked as a camp counselor for summer camp at Eckerd Park. I then had a brief stint in college at UIS initially. I eventually, I guess I would have been coming back when I was 19. When I was 19, I moved into the basement of my mother's building in Pilsen, and I lived there throughout my 20s. So, from Chicago, born and raised, that's where I lived. But that's just where I lived. Who am I is a bit more complex. My mother was born in Mexico. She came here when she was 2. My grandmother, a staunch Republican, brought her over, and she worked as a CTA bus driver for 30 years, retiring with a nice, healthy pension. But driving a CTA bus for 30 years makes you a bit rough around the corners. My grandmother, Electra, my abuela, is a very tough woman, very strong, independent woman with a green thumb. My mother was one of 7. Wait, is it 7? Or is it 25? Anna, Lily, my mom, Rocky, one of 6. So my mother is one of 6, being dealt her fair share of discipline from my grandmother, and she decided to break the cycle. She decided that never in my entire life will she ever lay a hand on me, and she has not, to her word. And one time I remember leaving off, I was given 2 weeks to do a project for school, and I didn't tell her about it till the night before that I need to go to I need to go to get supplies for this project that is due tomorrow. And she snapped on me, and she came back with great remorse. And I had to, even as a child, tell her, no, like, that seems very justified. I think that it was a very reasonable reaction to the situation that you were put in. But I was showered with kindness and love my entire childhood. So I'm very grateful to my mother for that. My mother and my father separated when I was quite young. So I've always had 2 households. My father grew up in a time where his parents never told him, I love you, which I think that many people can relate. I try not to judge anyone from the previous decades for their lack of emotional intelligence. This is simply the hand they were dealt. So, a kind, loving father, a bit emotionally distant, but kind and loving nonetheless. I feel as though I've lived a very blessed life. I look around me, as I grew up, I looked around, and I saw so many people so worse off than I was. I discussed this in a few different episodes, that growing up in the neighborhood I grew up in, I saw a great deal of misfortune. And so seeing this misfortune, a lack of money, a lack of food in the home, a lack of sometimes clean clothes, it affected me. It affected who I was as an individual. And from a very young age, I hope I hoped anyway that I was grateful. I believe living this way imparted a particular humility that benefits me as an adult. And hopefully one day I can strike it rich, and I think that this humility will I think this humility will benefit me greatly to remember that it is better to give than to receive. That not everyone has kind and loving parents. That I can empathize. So I exit childhood pretty unscathed as far as major traumas in my life. And I think that the greatest trauma in my life I inflicted upon myself. I was young, dumb, and full of bad decisions. And well, let's just say this. I was told by some, I was told by more than one prominent male figures in my life that I would find happiness up a skirt. And instead, I found a human person under that skirt who has emotions and has thoughts and wishes and goals. And it wasn't, mm, let's say, how do you put this? Let's say I was a very distracted young man, as most young men are. And I'm gallivanting about, and wouldn't you know it, 21 days after my 21st birthday, my first daughter was born. And I believe firmly that God gives you what you need. And God gave me a little girl so I can learn how it is to treat women, how I should be treating women. I remember growing up and telling all these little girls, "Oh, I love you, I love you. Oh, will you be my girlfriend? I love you." And then I, as an adult, held my child. I held my daughter for the first time. And I learned what love was. It was like, man, what in the world? I remember looking at her and thinking back and thinking to myself, man, what in the world was I thinking? I had absolutely no idea what the word love meant. I am very grateful for Isabella for teaching me this. About a year later, I have a second child born to a second woman. The details of my situation are a bit more complicated than they seem. But as I said, God gives you what you need. Well, this is the biggest self-inflicted trauma I could have possibly imposed upon myself, because it's not difficult to have two children with two women. What is difficult is trying to be a good father to two children when their mothers are in conflict. So I was in the so I put myself into a love triangle. So there I was, 21, about to turn 22, put into a love triangle. I tried to make it work with Alina's mom. It did not work. So I'm 22, working in a warehouse, trying to support myself and support my family, trying to be a good dad, and being in the middle of a constant tug of war between two women and between two children. And that was the trigger of my depression. I had the urge and the will and the want to be a good dad, but not the ability, because I couldn't devote enough time to both equally in a way that would be fair. So I'm 22, so I turned 22, and my second daughter is born, Alina, and thankfully, thankfully her mother was 22 also, and she wanted to hang out with her friends and go out and be a young woman. And so I was able to have Alina with me. I would say the way I break it down is at least 40% of the time, but in my mind, I feel as though it was half and half, where it was just me and Alina against the world. And I learned how to be patient, and I learned how to father. And Alina was just the most innocent creature, and so I never wanted to burden her with my woes, and so I didn't. We watched a lot of, you know, probably shouldn't admit this, but we watched a lot of Simpsons, which was something we both could enjoy for whatever reason. And I learned a lot. I learned a lot of early childhood development by going to Alina's preschool, but that wasn't until she was like 3 or 4. I'm kind of jumping the gun because Isabella and Vidi were locked at the hip. Who am I? So in 2010, I became a parent. But Isabella and Vidi have always had a very strong support system with Vidi's mom and her entire family. So I really didn't have Isabella alone. But Alina and I, it was Alina and I against the world, where she and I don't want to say raised each other, but it kind of. I mean, if I'm being honest, I wasn't an adult. I was still, at 21 years old, I was still a child. And I grew up trying to keep her happy and safe and fed and emotionally supported. And there were nights where she would simply cry and cry and cry, and I held her in my arms while she cried for hours and with no explicable reason. Uh, but I think in those moments we bonded. Fast forward to 2018, 2019, Isabella's mom and I try to work things out again, and we move in together, and we've been together ever since. Isabella and I have bonded a lot now since we moved in together, and that's been really nice. In 2019, Zalia was born, and she has only ever known Vidi and I together in the house. And because of my work schedule, I get a lot of weekdays off. So again, as it was in 2014, I'm spending a lot of quality time with Zalia, just she and I. And that's been really, really nice. And I bring up my children because when I reflect on who am I am a father. And I have been a father for my entire adult life. So as I continue to reflect, let's see, who am I? Who is Justin Roberson? I told you where I'm from. I told you a little bit about my parents. I told you about my parenting, my being a father. What else do you need to know? I've always felt as though I was intelligent. I think that I never had the proper drive or even ambition to do something with it. So I think to the frustration of a lot of my teachers, I coasted through most of my schooling, which when I got to college slapped me in the face when I found out how much reading and studying it was required to actually pass these classes. And so I never graduated. I have enough credits to get an associate's degree, but I don't even have that. My education has always been a self-education, and I've only ever really been able to study things that I was interested in. I always loved the math, so I focused and studied in those classes. I never really liked reading. Perhaps I have ADHD, perhaps I have some form of dyslexia undiagnosed, but I've never been a strong reader. Most of the books I do now are audiobooks. But even still, I absorb information. Uh, I crave information. I crave wisdom and I crave knowledge. And this was before my journey, I think. I'm trying to do like a whole background on my whole life. My cousin Gary really nailed it on the head in our interview. He said, "You were lost." He said there was a time in which I could just tell you were lost. And I think that I've been lost for most of my life. Sought happiness in all the wrong places, and I really didn't know where to look. And really, at 33, I'm only now finding continual happiness. But I'm blessed. I have a friend group that I trust and I love. I have my family, which is a big family that I also trust and love, and I care for them and they care for me. I have both my parents who love me dearly. So why wouldn't I be happy? I have 3 healthy children. But something along this journey I realized is it's not good enough to just be happy. Because I don't live on an island. So I think I saw happiness my entire life as everyone seeks happiness. It wasn't until 2014 that I began to search for peace specifically. And actually, I found it rather quickly. I think that I was in a pretty bad depressive state, so I really was eager to get out of it. And I I began to paint. I took up other social activities that I took up other activities to distract my mind. I began to make active efforts to keep a clean home and keep a clean body, and that was working myself towards a more peaceful life. But then I learned rather quickly that it's not good enough to just have inner peace. I looked around me and I said, well, how can I keep my peace if those in my circle and those, I call it my bubble, if those in my bubble don't have it also? So I said, okay, let me study this subject. And so I did. My cousin Gary told me I was lost, and I was. Let's go back to that. It really took me aback and made me reflect on my life so far. Just the honesty of my cousin Gary. I admitted that when I'm working towards something, like for instance, inner peace, I'm working away from something else, which is the feeling I was feeling at the time. And I believe it has evolved since then, from being simply me running away from this depression to me really seeking lasting peace. Now I have peace regularly and often. Now I'm seeking to protect my peace. Now I'm seeking to share this peace. Now I'm seeking to keep it and hold it and strengthen my resolve. The Buddha would say is your he doesn't say inner peace, but uh, is your the Buddha would say is your wisdom like that of a small tree, able to be shaken by the wind, Or is your wisdom like that of a mountain, unaffected? Of all the different research subjects I could have chosen, I'm really happy that I chose this one because it has positively impacted my life in such a manner that it got to the point where I had too much information to keep to myself. And I must share this information outward. And that's where we left off. And that was the beginning of the journey. And as far as who I am, I think that I can't talk about who I am without discussing inner peace, because for my entire adult life, it has been at the forefront of my mind. Am I at peace? Why am I not at peace? What brings me peace? Who brings me peace? Who deters my peace? How do I prevent that person from deterring my peace? I can safely say that I've dove down the rabbit hole. In high school, one of my teachers gave out bogus awards, and I was the white rabbit because I was always late, which is fitting enough because, like the white rabbit, I've dove down the rabbit hole. And this has led me to so many questions, and so many new questions, and so many new ideas, and so many new philosophies that have benefited my life in a positive manner. Which leads me directly to my next question. What are my goals? I believe in shooting for the moon. So my goal is world peace. As I state in the introduction, I believe that when every individual obtains inner peace, this is world peace. So I must consider and think about not only how do I obtain inner peace, but how can everyone obtain inner peace? And this question leads me down a new rabbit hole. What are the basic social constructs that we can create to facilitate the beginning of the journey towards peace? For instance, food, water, shelter. I think I mentioned this all in the introduction, so I don't want to redo the introduction. And I'll let the introduction speak for itself. I feel as though if you want to get a good grasp as to who I am, I would recommend starting from the beginning. Take a listen to the introduction, and it gives a great jumping off point for who I am and what I stand for. I think it gives a good idea of my goals as well. Shoot for the moon. When every individual obtains inner peace, this is world peace. So how then does every individual obtain inner peace? Well, goal number 2, I want every individual to begin the quest to achieving inner peace, which is simply to be mindful of it. To be mindful of, if you are at inner peace right now, what is preventing this inner peace from dwelling within you? And to keep it at the forefront of your mind. Am I at peace today? Can I look around, count my blessings, literally count my blessings, and say, today is a very peaceful day? And every day will not be a peaceful day. But if I can have more peaceful days than not, I think that I would call that a success. A big part of this journey is gratitude. Gratitude is a learned behavior. I can make active efforts to intentionally decide that I'm going to be grateful for all of the wonderful blessings that are in my life, whether they be your car, your house, your warm bed and blanket, your loved one, your animal. To be mindfully grateful of all of the wonderful blessings in your life. And so I would like to say thank you. I would like to say thank you to anyone that may hear this voice. I would like to say thank you to anyone that may listen to this episode. Thank you to anyone who has listened to any of the prior episodes and any episodes that I post in the future. I am thankful to my family and friends who have been incredibly supportive, who have inquired about this happening that I'm doing. I am thankful for Raru Bahena because I can officially say I have at least one fan. I am very grateful to my other friends who have been incredibly supportive, who have told me that they have listened to previous episodes. Some went as far as to tell me that my episode with Chris Rhodes helped them with their depression. And I'm very grateful to Chris Rhodes. Let's make a list of everyone I'm grateful for so far. So, episode 1, a self introduction. I am thankful for 6 months ago, Justin, and 1 year ago, Justin, who recorded that self introduction audio with no intention of posting it or sharing it in any manner, in any way, and simply did it for wanderlust, who simply did it on a whim, who created something that I can use as a platform of where I stand in the world. I'm grateful for my Nana, who raised me into who I am, who gave me the humility that I possess, who gave me the love and kindness that I share with the world. I'm grateful to my big cousin, Gary, who, despite being a very imposing gangster, shared with me love and shared with me his wisdom and shared with me honesty. And I'm very grateful for his honesty. And I'm very grateful for the things that he taught me in just that one episode. This was my first recording, so it was not a very good recording. I think my questions were still in the form of interviewing for the purposes of my book. So a lot of the questions weren't tailored to him as much. Instead, I was looking for him to validate some of my own ideas. And lesson learned. Something that he states in the episode is, he said, I use his words, he said, I tell you all the time, shut the fuck up. And he does. And as an interviewer especially, you need to learn to shut the F up, because you want to highlight your guest. And you want your listeners to get a feel for who this person is and what do they have to share with you. And lesson learned. I'm very grateful for him allowing me to experiment with him, on him, and I'm very grateful for his honesty about some very sensitive subjects. I'm thankful to my big cousin Nicole, Nikki. You influenced me more than any of the interviews I've done so far, past or present, because you gave me such good advice. I've actually took your words and used them in, I think, every single interview after that. Specifically speaking of the risk factors and the protective factors, but not only that, about protecting your peace, about living life as an empath. You really taught me some things about learning how to protect my peace while also being a very generous spirit. And I'm very grateful for you for sharing your time with me, and it was a lovely conversation that I will cherish, whether it was an episode or not. I'm thankful for my friend, Jesus Chewy, who was also an experimentee, because right after I did an interview with Gary, I think just the next day, I went to Chewy's house and recorded another interview where I tried a different set of tactics. And that conversation is, let's just say there will be a part 2. I only had ideas that I wanted to discuss, and you were patient and you allowed me to ask whatever questions I had, and and answered them to the best of your abilities. And you gave me some really insightful, good answers. And I'm very grateful for that. I'm grateful for Chris Drain, who was another experimentee. I had a more definite list of questions that I wanted to ask, many of which had nothing to do with inner peace, because I was experimenting and trying to find the voice of the podcast. What do I want the podcast to sound like? Do I want it devoted to one subject and one subject specifically? Do I want to get to know this person incredibly deeply? Do I want to know this person's opinions on pop culture? So, another experimentee who gave me incredible answers, who is a very dear friend, who led with honesty. And when the conversation went from rap and rap music to a more personal subject of him and his life and his family, he was incredibly honest. And I'm very grateful for his honesty. I'm grateful for my next guest, Chris Rhodes. Chris Rhodes. So at this point, I determined that I'm going to have all my questions written ahead of time, and I'm sharing them with the guests. But with Chris, I purposefully didn't, because I knew that the subject matter that I wanted to discuss with Chris is going to be a very heavy conversation. And I wanted his answers to be raw and real. And he provided. We talked about the spirit. We talked about depression. I think it wasn't 5 minutes into the conversation before we started talking about depression. And it's a very heavy episode. And I'm very grateful for his honesty, because a friend reached out and wrote me a message and told me that that episode with Chris helped them with their depression. And I said all along, if I can help one person with one good idea, then this entire effort would have been worth it. And in that moment when I got that message, it all became worth it. I'm grateful for my friend Jose Zuazo, who's an established podcaster in Chicago, who really gave me some good tips and tricks, and even tricks for the editing process, who I have turned to for advice more than once about podcasting, about editing, what mic to use, and things like that. That was a very fun episode. I'm grateful for Jose Zuazo for lightening up the mood. And I'm grateful for my future guests as well. We're all caught up to present day time. The next question is, what's next? I think that out of this podcast, I don't think that someone has to be famous to have something to share. So I want to converse with everyone. I want to find interesting people who I think have an interesting perspective, and I want to know their perspective on all things related to their particular subjects of focus, and also their perspective on inner peace, all things inner peace. And so hopefully will continue this journey. And so I will continue this journey. And every 2 weeks, I hope to bring you a new voice, a new interesting perspective. I hope that I can create something worthy of your time. I'm very grateful to all of you who may listen to this. I'm grateful for all of you who share this. I'm grateful for anyone who knows me and is simply listening to this as a way to express your love. For anyone new who does not know me, welcome to my blue circle. For anyone who may not know who I am or what I'm about, I would go back and listen to the introduction. How do I wrap this up? I am very proud of what I have produced so far. I think that my early episodes are very experimental, so forgive me if they're not as polished as something that you may be used to. But I would recommend going back and starting from the beginning. To prepare for this episode, I went back and I listened to every single episode back to back, and it took a while. I listened to it at 2 times speed, but I'm very proud of what I've created so far. I think that despite being a total novice, it is simply an interesting subject matter. So I'll leave you with this. I hope that each of you may find inner peace within yourself. Thank you for being a part of this journey. As always, may peace be with you. Thank you for your time. Peace and love.